Well, we're about a minute past the hour, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining the webinar today. My name is Lisa Marie Pratt. I'm the Senior Specialist of Affiliate Relations with the Association for Clinical Oncology. Thanks for joining this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's call will be recorded and made available following this event. All participants' lines will remain muted throughout today's call. Please feel free to ask questions via chat, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Questions posted in the chat will be answered throughout the program today. If you have any additional questions at the conclusion of this presentation, please use the raise hand feature and your line will be unmuted so that you may ask the speaker the question. Our speaker today, Cecilia Sepp, CAE, CNAP, is principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting. Cecilia is a recognized authority in the nonprofit organization management and a leader who translates vision into action. She shares her expertise as a writer, speaker, podcast host, and skilled facilitators in all aspects of nonprofit management. Today, she will present practical and tactical approaches to creating your board orientation program, from identifying content to making it accessible. So with that, over to Cecilia.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa Marie. And I do encourage everyone to share questions or comments throughout the webinar, because this is your time and I want to make the most out of it for you. So I am very pleased to be here to talk about board orientation programs and how to create them. I always like to share rules of engagement when I do a presentation. And again, I really encourage you to discuss with each other in the chat, ask questions, raise your hand, ask to be unmuted if you'd like to speak and share your thoughts with everyone. Please ask questions, float ideas. That's why we're here. Be respectful of each other's contributions. Let's collaborate and build on each other's ideas. So as we're moving on to this topic of board orientation and talking about orientation, I'd like to quickly refer back to the Fall State Leadership Conference where I presented on board engagement in a changing world. That was a discussion of more high-level strategic viewpoints and how environmental factors affect board engagement. But today what we're going to talk about is more of how you create a plan, what goes into orientation, what does it mean, why do we do it, and what is our ultimate goal. But I do want you to keep in mind as we're discussing this topic that strategy and tactics are intricately attached to each other. One does not work without the other. So I'd like to share one of my favorite Sun Tzu quotes from The Art of War. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So we just want to keep in mind that these two things are tied together, and some of our best tactics are going to be developed when we keep our strategies in mind. Now, pulling ourselves back to the issue of today, which is orientation. Well, what exactly does orientation itself mean? So dictionary.com tells us that orientation is the determination of the relative position of something or someone, especially yourself. So that's basically, where are you pointing? So to orient something is to point it in a direction or to set it in a place. And it tends to just, if it's moving, it goes forward in one direction. But the problem with this, though, is orientation can also tend to be static, and it doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility. So we want to make sure that we're flexible as we're creating our orientation programs, because what we want to do is empower our boards to develop themselves as leaders as they're going along. And we want to make sure they have the education that they need to succeed at that. So when we're talking about board orientation, the ultimate goal of this, again, is engagement. We want engaged board members, and the best way to do that is to make sure they understand where they're starting, where they're going, and all the tools that they have available to make that possible for them. This definition from the National Council of Nonprofits points out that an engaged board is a forward-thinking board. And so that means they're in motion, they're moving, it's more of a dynamic. So we want people to be moving forward, collaborating together, and partnering together. And that is the goal for all of our volunteer leaders, but especially at the board level. By the time someone has become a board leader, they should have the information training and some experience within the organization in order to make them successful and a great contributor. But if we think about orientation can tend to be static, can it support engagement that's active and dynamic? Well, if we look at what goes into what creates board engagement, again, orientation is education and understanding. And so what does that include for board engagement? Well, it's understanding why the people are there. Why are they at the table? What are their motivations to participate? This helps with developing orientation programs because if you know why they're there, you can train to it. And if they're there for one reason, like I want to add something to my resume, I want to expand my horizons, then you know, well, this is a person that maybe wants to learn more and maybe doesn't want to just put something on the resume. Maybe we want to show them how they can get a lot more out of that. Board education, of course, a key component of orientation. I think we can all agree to that because they need to understand their role. And that's really the question that you want to answer with an education program for a board member. Do they understand their role? Why are they there? And that's where job descriptions come in. You need to have a job description for each and every board member. All officers should have a job description, and each member of the board should have a job description. So there should be one for each officer, each director, and if they are a chair of a board committee, they need a job description for that as well. Because when we're doing an orientation program and we're creating that content in that direction, job descriptions help us set expectations and explain responsibilities. And by setting expectations and explaining these responsibilities, what that does is help us design the education format, the information that needs to be included, and how we're going to deliver it. Succession planning and leadership arcs are also very important for board engagement and, again, orientation. Because not everybody on the board wants to become an officer, but then you do have people who that is their goal. They ultimately want to be in an officer position. If that is the case, you want to make sure that you have the succession planning in place so that people are getting the training they need. So for example, if somebody says, I think I might want to be the treasurer in a few years, then you know they're going to need some financial training. They're going to need some background on budgeting and how assets are allocated within the organization. Having a leadership arc is important as well, because that builds engagement because people know where they're going. They start out as a committee member, they move up, maybe they become a board member, and then they say, well, I do want to become an officer or a board committee chair. And then you know which direction to point them in, and you know which education that they need. Because you want to answer that question, what's next for them? And in the end, what this does is build confidence in your board members through the training and the support offered. Because if we can build that confidence with people, then they're going to be more successful board member. And so by creating an orientation program that does that, we are creating building blocks for action. Because if the board has confidence through the training and orientation that you provide them, then they're going to know how to do their job, they're going to do it decisively, and they're going to do it thoughtfully. So when we're plotting the course for orientation, what are the areas that we need to look at? Well, there's 4 major areas. The first one is the most important one: information collection, document inventory, and resource evaluation. Because before you create an orientation program, you need to know what you already have. So if you ever do research, this is similar to secondary research. What do we already have? What's in existence? And where is it? That's another question I think we tend to forget to ask ourselves, is where is the information that we want to give to people? We want to make sure where it is. We're all busy people with full days, and we keep information in a lot of different places. It could be on a hard drive, it could be hard copy on paper in a file folder somewhere in a drawer, It could be in a book, it could be in an old notebook. We need to find out where everything is. And is this information that needs to be updated? Is this information that can be organized in a different way, or is it ready to go and we know where it is? More importantly, are we missing anything? Because if we're missing information we need for this training, then we want to make sure we go out and find it and we fill those gaps. A lot of times, it's something to be aware of, I think, from my own experience, is making sure that we capture information from people who may be moving on in their career. So if you have a staff person who has been doing some training for your volunteer leaders at any level, you want to make sure you get all of that information from them before they move on to their next position. That is really a key thing that I think we tend to forget. So there's a helpful reminder for that. So now that we've gone over all the information we already have, we have our document inventory and we know what's missing, we filled those gaps. Now we need to assess our delivery systems and communication tools. So how are we going to get all this information out to everybody? Where are we going to put it? And how are we going to build the education? An important question to ask yourself is, how do our leaders communicate? So do they like to do real-time webinars? Do they like to watch on-demand webinars? Do they prefer in-person training? Would they rather do one-on-one mentoring training where somebody just walks them through something individually? So you need to figure that out as well. So you may need to have several different delivery systems for board orientation, especially if you have a board where people may come and go throughout a board term, because there's just certain things in life we can't control, like illness or retirement or unfortunately death. And sometimes people have to move on and we need to get a new board member in the middle of a term. So we also need to keep that in mind as well. So we need to think through, when are people coming onto the board? And when they come on the board, how quickly do we need to get them up to speed? And how can we do that within that person's schedule and within the schedule of the organization, the life cycle annually of the organization? What I mean by that is, when are the board meetings? When are the annual conferences? Where are the places people can get together? We need to keep that in mind as well when we're planning our delivery systems. Where will people be and when will they be there? Another thing we need to do when we're plotting our orientation is identify leadership characteristics. So what do we look for in a volunteer leader, and what characteristics does our current board bring to us already? What do we already have? Now, leadership characteristics are, what types of people are you looking for the board? Are you looking for people who are self-motivated, who already know how to be on a board? They understand everything already? Are you looking for people who can motivate other people? Are you looking for a mix of people? Maybe you need some, what we like to refer to as quiet leaders, which are people who maybe are a little more introverted and they like to do things on their own or maybe with a small group of people. So what kind of people are we looking for? What kind of people are already there, and how can we address that? We also need to know, in addition to who is on the board currently, who's in the leadership pipeline. Who's on your committees or in your chapters that are making a difference that you may want to put into a leadership development program? Because we always have to be thinking not just about the current board, but the future board. So leadership pipelines and leadership development all through your volunteer system are key to creating a good and strong board orientation program, because over time, what will happen is you will build a volunteer orientation program that builds on every level of that person's volunteer leadership experience. And I see we have a comment in the chat. Okay, it's just encouraging people to raise your hand and ask questions. So I like to second that. Thank you, Lisa Marie. So again, what we want to do in quick summary of this section, we need to identify our information. We need to assess our delivery systems and communication tools, identify our leadership characteristics, and then answer the question of who's already on the board and who's in our pipeline, because you're going to want to keep that in consideration. Now, these are the steps we follow to create our program. And education and leadership development are connected, not just for the board, but for all of your volunteer leaders. So when we are plotting our orientation, when I say plotting, that's like making a map. How are we going to get there? We want to get from point A, no idea of how to be a board member, to point B, knowing how to be a board member and knowing what is expected, to point C, which is being a successful board member. Because that is really the goal. Our ultimate goal is a great experience for our volunteer leaders at all levels, especially the board of directors, because it's hard work and we ask a lot of our board members. So we want them to have a great experience that also contributes to our organization's long-term success. So when we're creating these experiences at all these different levels, we want to make sure that people learn something new, which is where board orientation is key, because they can learn about being a board member. They may be a board member on another group, but you might be presenting them something new about being a board member, and that's important too. But we also want them to be able to take information they already have from their real world experience and apply it to their volunteer experience. So for example, you may want to go out and you may want to recruit somebody who already has a strong financial background to consider training them up to become the treasurer. You may want to go out and find people who are great leaders or great at motivating people, and you want to train them and teach them about the organization so that they can become the chair of the board. But you always have to be thinking ahead, because your board orientation program is always going to be evolving as you get new board members, as your organization grows and changes, as new things change in the profession or industry that you represent. So again, orientation is ongoing and it's going to be evolving and changing. So if we're going from point to point, we're going A, B, C, not knowing how to be a board member to knowing how to be a board member to being a successful board member, let's think about orienteering for a moment. And you might say, whoa, orienteering, the heck is this about? Well, if you've ever done orienteering, it's actually kind of fun. It tends to be related to sports, but it can also be a team building and confidence building exercise. I did it as a child at a place called Camp Don Bosco in Missouri. And what they did is they gave us a series of tasks and they gave us a map and they gave us the tools we needed to complete this journey around the camp. So it was something like a scavenger hunt. But orienteering is basically teaching people how to figure out where to go by giving them the tools and letting them use it. So if we keep that in mind, and we take a different approach to developing board orientation, and we think of it as board orienteering, what we're doing is creating a program of all the information and education and skills that a board member needs, giving them the tools to successfully navigate the organization and navigate their own leadership path. It shows them how to do it, the processes, and it creates a meaningful experience because, again, it's dynamic, it's not static. And so we're teaching them how to be a leader and find their way through the organization. And it's a lot more fun, in my opinion. And I think they learn more and they can contribute more because they're shown how to do it. They're not told, they're not directed. They grow and they learn and they find things along the way by having access to all of this information you are going to set up and all the training you give them through the orientation process. And then you let them use all the tools that you've developed for them over time. This is active and it's dynamic. And that's really what we want with a board. Because again, if we're going to create a board orientation process, what we want is we want to have leaders. We don't want people that we're going to show what to do or tell what to do all the time. We want them to learn how to do it and learn how to lead with our support and with our ongoing input and advice and information. So really though, what does this mean? Okay, so I've talked about orienteering. What we want to do is we want to create a process for your board to get all the information they need and create a self-guiding journey to a certain extent. You might be thinking, well, well, if it's a self-guiding journey, what does that mean for processes or procedures? Well, actually, what that means is they will learn the processes and procedures, like, how the board meeting runs, the board culture, board agenda, by being trained to it. And then they can do that training, find that information on their own whenever they need it. So if they want a refresher, they can go find it. If they have a question, they can look up the answer. You want to also empower them to find what they need when they need it. And that's actually similar to the definition of relevance, having what someone needs when they need it. So we want our board orientation to be relevant as well. But we also want them to be able to find the relationships they need. We all mentor each other, whether we think about it or not. And board members who are successful will be able to mentor each other because they will be able to find that person who can answer a question for them or give them some advice. So let's say, for example, you have board committee chairs. Well, a board committee chair might be a new board committee chair, and they might want to get some advice from somebody who's chaired that committee in the past, or maybe is chairing another committee for the second or third year in a row. And then that is going to create a way for them to find each other. So we want to set that up as well. We want to encourage the board to contribute to the ongoing evolution of the training program so it fits their current needs, but also addresses the needs of future leaders. You already have a think tank. It's called your board of directors. So whenever you want to look at your orientation program and see if it needs to be tweaked or if there's some new trend going on with people coming up in the organization or coming up in that profession or industry, you can go to your board members and say, well, we're looking at the board orientation. What do you think? Are we missing something? Is there a new trend we need to address? Are people using a new technology? Do people talk about different things? Are they referring to different books? So you have on your board already people who have been through your orientation, who are using it, who can give you some input along the way and say, well, when I first came on the board 5 years ago, this was great. But now things have actually changed quite a lot. The organization's grown. We have a lot more members. We have a lot more programs and activities. And I think we need more education and training on that and what that means for us as board members when we're making decisions. You want to allow them to develop their leadership skills and their expertise through the orientation. The orientation should support that. Everybody has different skills and different backgrounds, and everybody's a different kind of leader. But we want to give them that space and that room and that support in order to develop those leadership skills on the board. We also want to create understanding of their role and how they contribute to the success of the organization. So when we're talking about that, we get the job description for a board member or an officer. We get a job description for a board committee chair. So they know that role and they know that job. The context within which they're doing that work is important. And that's also part of orientation. Because if we think about the actual definition of orientation, which is to orient something or put it in place, especially oneself, then we need to know how what we're doing relates to the larger whole. So an orientation program needs to help people understand where they fit in the overall work of the organization and how they can contribute to that. That also contributes not to just their individual success, but it contributes to the overall success of the organization. Because if a person understands how what they do is contributing to mission fulfillment and understanding how things work and understanding what their part of the team of leadership is contributing to, that actually broadens education. And again, if we think of our board orientation as a starting point for education, that's a key part of it, is educating people about where they fit in the organization. So I want to share this case study. This is from my actual experience. I am an experienced association executive, but I am also an experienced volunteer. And I volunteered at a lot of different groups over the years. And I belong to ASAE, the American Society of Association Executives. And a lot of you have probably heard of that group. Well, I was very active there in the 2010s, and I was on a group called the ASA Communications Section Council, which is now the Communications Professionals Advisory Council. That group is similar to a committee or a board of directors in a way, because ASA has sections. Each section has a council that's made up of the leadership of the section. A couple of years before I joined the council, that council had committed to their plan as opposed to what the project of the chair that year was. And I think that's something that we've really gotten away from in the association world. But years ago, some of us who have been around for a while remember that every year what we were doing changed based on who the chair was, whether it was the chair of a council or the chair of the board of directors. And I think we have made a great turn toward focusing more on our strategic plans and implementing our plans. So I was a section member, and then I became an ad hoc volunteer on a committee. And then I was appointed to the council because I participated. So that was my leadership arc. So I went from member to ad hoc volunteer to appointment to the council. I then eventually went on to go through the leadership, and I was chair-elect, chair, and then past chair, and ended up being on the council for about 5 years. So that's an example of a leadership arc and a volunteer who was given the experience and the opportunity to participate. Every year, all the new and current members of that council were part of contributing to the plan and what's next, because we were all part of creating that and implementing it. Every year, and this is key, we had an onboarding webinar for all the new members, and current council members or experienced council members could come as well. And what we did is we would present what is the culture of our council, what are our plans, how do we do things, our processes. How do we get involved? How do we engage the members of the section, not just ourselves, the leaders? And so our outcome was this: highly successful council with engaged leaders and engaged members. Because we thought this through, we communicated it, and we educated people. So using this case study, keeping in mind what we've already talked about, you might be saying to yourself, well, this is great. We have a nice overview. Here's a good case study. That's an outcome. But where do we start? How do we create an orientation plan? Or how do we improve our orientation plan? So I like to always start with the basics. So when you're creating an orientation plan, and you probably already have a lot of this in place for yourself and your leadership, this is what I call the necessary basics. So you have your foundational documents and corporate information, your job descriptions, which we've already touched on a little bit. And then you want to make sure that they know the different kind of membership types you have. What are the dues? What are benefits and services? And you might be saying, well, why would a board member need to know that? And that's a good question. Well, you want them to be able to answer questions from members. So a member may say to them, well, you're on the board. Maybe you can answer this question for me. So by giving them that kind of information, they can do that. And maybe they don't remember, at least they'll know, well, I do know the staff person that I can refer you to. So make sure they have that kind of information. You want to make sure they understand what communication avenues are available to them, available to them. That could be an online community, that could be email, that could be telephone. Some people may even be texting each other. You never know. But you want to make sure they know what's there that they can use for each other. And then you also want to be really clear on how many hours a month are going to be expected from them, depending on what their role is on the board of directors. So a board member may put in 4 hours a month, but the chair of the board may put in 12. A board committee chair may put in 6. You want to try to give them an accurate estimate of how many hours you're going to be looking for. Because when we're talking about volunteers, it's really important to keep in mind they're giving us a slice of their time, a piece of their life. So we want to make sure that they can balance everything else in their life as well as this. And we don't want to overburden them. And we don't want them to feel stressed out because they're volunteering. So if we're clear in our expectations with our volunteers, then that makes it a smoother experience for them, for everybody. Then money boards, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. Money boards and working boards need different things. So money boards need to know about fundraising, and working boards might need a different level of administrative support. And oh yes, hey Betsy, yes, you can definitely get a copy of the slides. I've already given them to Lisa Marie to distribute after the webinar. Great question, thank you. So I want to circle back to foundational documents and corporate information for a moment, because I mentioned on this list statement of purpose and in the articles of incorporation. Now, you all know the articles of incorporation are what establishes your organization as a corporation. It's a nonprofit corporation, but it's still a corporation status. You don't need to give the entire articles of incorporation to people unless you feel that's a good idea. That's a call you have to make. But you would probably want to pull out your statement of purpose, because your statement of purpose is basically your original mission statement. The statement of purpose is what drives the mission development, what that statement is. And then it's probably going to inform to a certain extent your vision and your core values. So that's why that's important. So we have a couple more comments. Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. Excuse me. So bylaws, that's a given. I hope we all think that's a given that we're going to give those out. That's really important for your board members to have that, because that is your governing document. So the articles of incorporation, again, I like that because of the statement of purpose. The bylaws are your governing document, and your policies and procedures are informative. They educate. And that's why it's really important to make sure your code of ethics and standards of conduct are incorporated into that policies and procedures. You want to make sure they have that. And you especially want to make sure that they understand whatever process there is for enforcement with a code of ethics or standards of conduct. That's a really essential thing if you have a code of ethics. The strategic plan is what we follow. That's what we look to. That's what we're going to do to fulfill our mission. Now, I suggest here under foundational documents that you provide at least the last two 990 forms that are available. If you can give them 3, that's even better. But you want to kind of give them an idea of the last couple of years of the financial situation and what's been reported to the IRS, because that's the thing that board members are actively responsible and accountable for, is the activities of the organization. And that is really important that they understand that. So you want to make sure they have that information. An organizational chart, not just for staff, but also for volunteers. How's the volunteer system set up? If we can give them that, those two things, they know how things flow. They know who does what, and they know who they can ask questions. So all of those things, that's really important. And then under job descriptions, I just want to emphasize again, in the job descriptions, you want to be very clear. But when you're training to this in your orientation program, you again want to emphasize board members, they're the leaders of the organization. They're responsible and accountable for the organization's activities. That is a key part of their role. So you want to make sure they understand that. It's not scary, but we want to make sure they know, hey, you've taken on a big job and we really appreciate it. And so we want to make sure you're prepared for that. So when we're looking at the necessary basics and how this is our starting point for creating our orientation program, this actually could be used as an outline for designing an orientation program. This could be the initial orientation program. You just follow all of this and explain it and how it's all connected to each other. So let's look at that as our starter kit as we move on. Excuse me. Now that we've reviewed our basics, what do we do next? Well, what do we do next after we know all of this wonderful information that we have to provide is we want to analyze our board community. Now, when we're looking at our board community, why do we do this? Because we need to know Who our audience is. We talk a lot about audience with communication and marketing, but our board is an audience too. And they're one of our most important audiences. So if we're creating an orientation, training, education program for them so they can orienteer their leadership experience, we need to know who they are. So if we start with the board type, the community of the board, what kind of board is it? Is it a money board? If you're not familiar with a money board, that's a board that focuses on fundraising and getting donations. They may even write you a check. They make sure that money's coming in. They don't do a lot of volunteer work necessarily. They will go out and get their friends, the other members, donate money to your foundation or to come to events and participate, but they're going to make sure money's coming in. A working board is a volunteer board where they actually roll up their sleeves and do the work. They're doing the project work. They're collaborating with staff on how to finish this project work and get it out to everybody and polish it up. They're hands-on. And I'll give you a couple quick examples of that. So a money board is something you might find at a foundation or a charity, because it's very important for foundations and charities to have a lot of funding so that they can help all the people that they help. Using another example from my personal experience, I was on the board of a now defunct association for writers. It was a writing group. And so everybody on the board was writers. All the members were writers. So we were definitely not a money board because writers do not make a lot of money. So we were a working board. So we did a lot of the work ourselves because we had 1.5 staff. So that's the definition of a working board. So we would organize the conference. We would invite the speakers to the conference, make sure it got promoted, and work with the staff to get the venue. So that's the difference between a money board and a working board. So that's an important thing to know about your board. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, could I have a hybrid board? Could I have a board where some of the people get money and some of the people do work? Yes, you can. And that's why it's important to understand what kind of board you have. Another question to ask when you're looking at your board, and again, these are just a couple of suggestions, but how often do they meet? Do they like to meet every month? Do they like to meet quarterly? Do they prefer in-person meetings, or do they prefer Zoom meetings, or do they prefer teleconferences? So that tells you something about your board as well. That's an important characteristic. Now, does your board manage member committees? And what I mean by that is we have a lot of volunteer committees that are not board committees. Does the board work with those committees? Take the recommendations from those committees based on the work they do and make decisions with it? Or is the board actually doing the work? And what I mean by that is, are there board committees where all this work is running through the board as opposed to running through other volunteer committees? Now, though, that's a board you might find in a smaller organization. A bigger organization will probably have a pretty sophisticated committee system that reports back up to the board. And then again, the board might use that information to make decisions. So you need to know what kind of board you have. And that's going to change over time, depending on who's on your board. Then we have to break it down a little more. We've taken this broad approach. What kind of board do we have? And we want to break it down to our board members as individuals. Who is on the board? What are their demographics? Are they here to contribute? They really want to work. They want to be like a working board. Or are they here to build their resume? And that's okay, because building your resume is not a bad thing or a wrong thing, but it's good to understand that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if they're here to build their resume, you could find out, well, why are they building their resume, and help them figure out, well, what other kind of work could they do for the organization? And what kind of training might you be able to offer them? Another key question, how long have people been on the board? So you might say, well, gee, okay, well, I guess I would think of that right away. But I want you to also keep in mind, there's some organizations that do not have term limits. And if you don't have term limits, that means somebody might be on the board for a really long time, and you need to understand that. So you need to understand, like, first of all, do you have term limits? And if not, how long have some people been on the board? And if you do have term limits, that's an important question still, because you may have 2 3-year terms as your term limit. So if they've been on for 1 term or 2 terms, are they halfway through their 2nd term? So where are they in that process as well? So by analyzing the group, you get an understanding for the board as a community, because it is its own community within the larger community of the organization. And then you can figure out who are the individuals in that community. And then that's going to help you define your board's culture. And that's important because if we think back to the case study I shared from my own experience about how we would teach people how the council did things and basically impart our culture, you need to understand that so that you can support the culture or change it if needed, but you also need to be able to teach it. You need to be able to explain to the new board members what is the culture. And the culture is created by the people who are in that culture and how they behave toward each other and how they handle things, how they make decisions, how they interact. Those are all key things for creating your board culture. So now we've talked about the basics or our starter kit, which again can be your outline for an orientation program. We've assessed our board as a group and as individuals, and we figured out what their culture is. That's going to help us as well, because figuring out our board's culture will help us design an orientation program that fits their needs as a group and as individuals. So when we're talking about what do they need in addition to that starter kit and the initial education and training that they get, they might need some other kind of training and skill development, like media training. We live in a world of 24-hour social media. We have YouTube. We have people who can do FaceTime. We're recording things everywhere and saving it for posterity, or we're doing presentations on behalf of the organization. So we may need public speaking skills. So we want to train to that. And I think I could make the argument that social media training would fall under media training because it is media, because it's a way of communicating information and ideas. So we might want to teach people about that, like some pros and cons of it and some good rules to follow and the messaging that we want to consistently get out. There are people who like to do public speaking, but then there are other people who would prefer to write because they want the time to compose maybe an article or a blog post. They might want to create something to help the marketing department. Find out what people are good at, what they want to learn to do better, and give them those chances to do it. We might also need to give them that opportunity again to mentor each other. We all do that. Again, it's really important that we keep that in mind because we help each other all the time with questions and guidance, depending on where we are and what we're doing. We might also need advocacy training. If you're an organization that does advocate, you're talking to elected or appointed officials, you're maybe talking to other groups and trying to get them to join a coalition with you, you want to give them that training as well. And then financial education is really important, or what I like to call how to read nonprofit financial statements, which is also the name of a great reference book you can share with your board. But not everybody does accounting or bookkeeping or budgeting in their professional life. So giving them that financial education is really important for their success, especially since they are accountable and responsible for the activities of the organization. Excuse me. So this is where we can get specific. When we talk about what else do they need, this is where we can get specific to the individuals who are participating on our board and contributing. And this way we can help them create that really wonderful experience for them. So now that we've identified our starter kit and we've analyzed our board and figured out who's who and what else they might need individually for their own success, what we need to then think about is how are we going to deliver it? Because we have all this great information, we have an orientation program designed, we have figured out how we want to educate, what we want to teach, but then how are we going to get it to people? Because we're in a 24/7 world, we all have full schedules, we're trying to balance a lot of different things. So how are we going to get it to them? So when we think about that, the old standby is a board manual. And that's that old 3-ring notebook that we used to get, where, you'd mail it to people and they'd be like, oh, this is great. I can flip through it and look at things. But that's not very practical anymore in today's world because things do change and they change quickly. So an updated standby is a digital board manual. So you could create a digital board manual. It's easier to update and distribute because you can post it online in a board members only area, or you can email it to them. And then if it's a PDF document, they can print it out if they want a hard copy and make notes on it. So this way, people, again, creating their own experience. I can print it out and have a hard copy, or I can just read it on the PDF on my device, whichever device I want to use. An even more modern approach to this is a digital online library for board members, where again, it's a board members only area and you put all the information you want them to have access to in one place with a table of contents or bookmarks, however you want to set it up, and then they can just look for what they want. So that's the how resources that we can deliver to people and how we can deliver that. So some other tools, online community for board members. Again, a board members only community. That's a really important way to build engagement and to find out what they need or to get information from them. Because again, think of your sitting board as a think tank about what you can do next and how you can improve your resources and training. On-demand videos, I think, are great. They don't have to be long. They can be 5 minutes or less. You can just explain something very quickly in a video or even in an audio file about a new policy, or just explain a procedure for a new board member. How do you get reimbursed for expenses for traveling to a board meeting? You can just make a video and show them how to fill out that Excel form and how to submit their receipt copies. So there's a lot of different ways we can use on-demand video. There's in-person training at meetings. We want to make sure that we use these opportunities for connection as much as possible, whether it's in person or online in real time. But in-person training at conferences is a fantastic way to help your board and to train them and to refresh orientation. I encourage people to do some sort of board training or orientation at every board meeting, at every in-person conference. It doesn't have to be half a day. It could be half an hour. It could be an hour, but just refresh things for them. Keep it top of mind as they're going through their leadership experience. Real-time online training is another great way to do it because you can pull your board members from all over the country together in one place at the same time and explain everything to them in real time in a real conversation. You can use the chat box. You can have just on discussion. People can just be allowed to talk. And then again, mentoring. Board members should be encouraged to mentor each other. And I encourage people to talk to their board members about the concept of micro-mentoring. And micro-mentoring means it's not a long-term formal mentoring relationship. It means you might mentor somebody for an hour or just for a couple of days or a couple of months because maybe they're learning something new or they just have a question. So we all can micro-mentor each other on a regular basis. And we have a comment. We do in Michigan. Yes, we find it very helpful in engaging our members and pushing information out about events or advocacy initiatives. And so does Southern California. Great. Okay. So as we are moving along in our leadership design experience here, we all need a destination on our journey. And I think we've all heard that wonderful affirmation. It's not the destination, it's the journey. But sometimes that's not very practical. The practical application is, yes, we do need a destination on our journey because we are ultimately trying to get somewhere. And that's the same thing with a board orientation program. We are trying to help our board members learn how to do their best, feel like they're contributing, and get something else out of that experience. So we do have a destination when it comes to board orientation, which is why I encourage you to think of it as board orienteering, because you want it to be an ongoing process, a journey as they're going to the point, the ultimate goal of board success and organizational success. So you can map out for your board members how they can help with all of these important areas because board members are leaders. They're visible. They are your best ambassadors for the organization, especially to your members and your volunteers. So if you educate them through the orientation program about how they can help with membership recruitment and retention, how they can help with member engagement, how they can help identify other volunteers, how they can help do training for other volunteers. So think about how incredible that would be to have board members come and do a volunteer training session at your annual conference for newer or younger members who want to become a volunteer. And then here are leaders from the board of directors coming and taking a few minutes and telling them something that they know about volunteering and sharing their experiences. And again, use your board of directors to help continue developing your education and training to improve engagement, and help board members learn how to engage each other as board members. If you have a newer board member and maybe they're not comfortable yet, maybe they don't know the other board members very well, that's a great way to get people engaged, is ask a more experienced board member to talk to that newer board member and just see if they have any questions. That's education, that's mentoring, that's engagement. Also, the member experience and volunteer experience. Ask your board members, they're your leaders. They've probably been through your volunteer process. They've come up maybe from a committee or as an ad hoc volunteer, and they can tell you about that experience and the volunteer experience, but also teach them what are the benefits and services that members get. Because again, your board is a powerful ambassador on behalf of the organization. So the more they know that they can answer questions from members, the better ambassador they can be. And so that should also be part of the board orientation. So we have to talk about the future board. The current board and the leadership pipeline are connected, and they are intimately connected because you always have to be looking ahead as board leaders and as staff leaders of who is going to be our board in 3 years or 2 years or 5 years. Who are we developing? Who are we finding in our membership that is demonstrating leadership characteristics that we want to develop, that we want to bring them in? There's a lot of different ways to find out what people are interested in and what they're good at. So again, I like to use the treasurer example because it's very difficult to find people who have a strong financial background that will also volunteer to be your treasurer. It's in my opinion, it's one of the hardest positions to fill because it does take a little more effort and time as well, because there's a lot more data that has to be managed. So if you find somebody who's interested in that, find out if they're willing to learn about committees or learn about how to make the budget, like invite them to a budget meeting, and just so they can learn. Be open as you're creating orientation programs to inviting volunteers who are less experienced, who are not on the board yet, to come to some of these meetings just as observers and just kind of see what's going on. Again, it's another form of mentoring. But you can find people through your committee activity. If you have a working group or a task force, if they're doing presentations at your conferences, you're going to find people. People demonstrate leadership, and you can say, that is a person that we think we want to bring along and have on our board in the future. So let's talk to that person. Let's get them into our leadership development program. If you don't have a leadership development program, that is a great thing to create, because that's another membership benefit that you can promote, especially to people who are new to your profession or organization, or who are younger professionals in your organization. Because if you can offer a leadership development program for your members, that's something they can take with them everywhere. It's completely portable. And when you're thinking about your board leadership orientation, again, that education, those skill sets that they create, that they expand, they develop, they nurture, that's portable for them. That's portable knowledge and skills that they can take through the rest of their life. So if you can make a younger member more valuable to their employer because they've been through a leadership development program, that's huge value creation right there. So you also want to educate your upcoming leaders. That's why you want to have a leadership development program. It can be as easy as just having them read a book and then meet with a senior member and discuss the book. It could be done quarterly. It doesn't have to be a huge additional program. It can be something that starts small and grows. And that's something we used to do at a job. I used to work at the American Academy of Otolaryngology, had a neck surgery years ago, and I was the director of Board of Governors and Society Relations. And that was our leadership development program. We would identify younger members. They would be given a book like Lincoln on Leadership, which is a great book for new leaders. And then they would read the book and discuss it with our chief staff executive. So that was really a cool experience for them as well. You can also identify leadership mentors, and you can design a leadership arc for each individual so they can follow their own path. After people top out, you need to have a path for after the board, because you don't want to lose that energy or that intellectual property or that commitment to the organization. And also, being somebody who used to be a volunteer and then wasn't suddenly, is kind of a strange feeling. So being on the board, maybe you're an officer and now you're not on the board and you're kind of like, oh, gee, what do I do now? This is a great way to continue member service and show appreciation for board members by having another path. What are they going to do after the board? Are they going to be on an advisory council? Could they go back on a committee? Could they be part of a mentoring program? Keep the engaged people engaged by finding something for them to do once they top out, as we like to say, of leadership. So how do you design a volunteer career arc, you might ask? Well, find out where they are in their career, assess their abilities and characteristics, ask them, what are your long-term goals for volunteering with the organization? Connect them with more experienced leaders and volunteers, and then help them design a plan that works for them. Because again, everybody's a little bit different. Some people are quiet leaders, some people are very extroverted, energetic, talkative leaders. And so we want to make sure that we're getting to know these leaders over time as individuals, and that we're helping them design a plan that works for them. And that's a great way to do it. This is also something that you can apply to your staff. So if you have staff that you want to keep, come up with a career arc for them as well. But this ties us back to that concept of orienteering as opposed to orienting, because if you help people orienteer their volunteer leadership experience, that gets them even more engaged. And I would make the argument it gets them engaged earlier. And I also really am a proponent of developing board members over time. We don't just want warm bodies. We want people who are there because they want to be there, whatever their reason is. They chose to be there, they want to contribute, and they want to work together collaboratively to move the organization forward. So as this journey continues toward leadership success, we want to make sure that we're turning information into knowledge. We're not just giving them a book or saying, here's a thing you have to do. We're actually turning that into something useful that they can apply later on in a different way, or that they apply more fully in their leadership role. It is an on-demand world, so make sure it's self-study whenever possible, though. And then people can take that and integrate it into their own knowledge base. You want to create understanding of how the organization actually works, connect the dots between those policy statements and how it's actually applied in the real world, for example. Provide tools for navigating that system, whether you go with an old school board manual that's a 3-ring binder, or you do a digital library for reference. Make sure they have the tools to follow that map for leadership. Keep data and information fresh. Don't post something that's from 5 years ago if you have something from last month. Make sure the data is constantly updated and refreshed, because the better information we give our leaders as we're orienting them and keeping them oriented throughout their career or their leadership arc, then the better leaders we're going to have and the better educated leaders we're going to have. And always keep asking yourself, are you leveraging your resources to the best of your ability? And that's time, money, intellectual property, and relationships. Those are the 4 building blocks of any successful program or volunteer experience. And again, as we're building an orientation program for our board leaders, those are things that we want to keep in mind, because they are giving us their time. They might be giving us their money. They might be spending their own money to come to a meeting. They're also sharing their own intellectual property and building the intellectual property of the organization. And then they're bringing relationships and they want to build new ones and improve the ones they already have. So in summary, when you're building a board orientation program, you want to identify the content. What do they need to know? You want to deliver that content. How are they connecting with that information? You want to connect content and action and create actionable knowledge. You don't want things to be static. You want them to be able to take what you teach them and apply it as they're doing their volunteer leadership work. You want to apply learning from the content, meaning that they can then fully partner with staff to achieve the goals of the organization. And all of these steps lead to understanding and service in support of the mission. So thank you all for attending our webinar today. There were not a lot of questions, but if there's any now, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Does anyone have any questions?
This is Betsy. I have a question. Oh, good. I am showing up as Betsy. That's why I kept saying my name. How would one go about, like, I've been, as Cecilia knows, studying for the CAE, so I'm clear on, like taking steps for investigating like an organization's culture, or rather the staff culture behind an organization. But how would you go about investigating the board culture when you are, for example, in our case, a lot of us are remote from our boards, so we're not around them 24/7 like we would be other staff. What are some tips that you could recommend on trying to collect like what makes up the culture of the board?
That is an excellent question, especially in the context of remote work and remote leadership. I would recommend right off the bat a qualitative study, if you will. Qualitative studies are basically interviews. So what you could do with your board members is you could think of 3 to 5 questions that you want to ask them about their board experience, what they would like to get out of that board experience, what you can do to help them understand their board experience, and also just ask them some questions about themselves as an individual. So for example, when I do qualitative studies for clients, I usually ask a couple of intro questions like, well, tell me about your role here at this organization or how you participate. And that's a great way to kind of break the ice with people and have people explain that to you. And then the secret to qualitative studies, though, is then you have to take all of those different interviews and put them together into a big overview or an amalgam of all the information you've gathered. And then you can identify different trends that people have shared with you. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it when people are spread around remotely is you could do something like this. You could have a real-time online discussion about what does board culture mean to you? And then you can have the board discuss it and create that definition of the board culture themselves.
Thank you. I have one more question, if it's okay. I was wondering if it was possible to get, like with the PowerPoint, if it's possible to get an example of, or maybe they have this on ASAE's site, but an example of, like, you had mentioned having a staff and volunteer organization chart. I'd be interested to see what, like, some have looked like in the past, because, doing both staff and volunteer organization chart sounds like almost like 3D in a way, as well as maybe an example of a really great like leadership arc, what that could possibly looks like. Or are we talking about like Wesley, I cannot remember his last name, his volunteer continuum, if that's what we're talking about? I'm just curious. And those are all my questions. Sorry.
Wow, that was a lot of questions. There's a lot of packed into that question, Betsy.
Yeah.
Okay, let me make sure I remember everything. So actually, when I said give them the volunteer organization chart and the staff chart, I was actually thinking of the 2 separate charts. So you have your organizational chart with staff and your organizational chart for volunteers. But now that you say that, I think kind of pulling those together, I'll be honest, I've never seen one. They're usually presented separately. I think that's an excellent idea to try to tie those together. Sometimes you might see on a volunteer chart that they will list the staff person who works with that committee or task force or working group, but they don't necessarily show how they fit into the overall organization as a whole. And I think that is an excellent idea, and that's something I will think about. Yeah, you mentioned the volunteer arc. That's one thing you can look at to reference. I tend to, when I'm working with clients on arcs, either career arcs or leadership arcs, I tend to create them for those specific people. But they all start with where people are and where they want to go. And if you answer those two questions, that's a great way to get started on that. And that can evolve over time. Very quickly, somebody had asked in a direct message, are there any recommendations for job description templates? Yes, I highly recommend BoardSource. They're a great place to go to. If you're a member of ASAE, ASAE has job descriptions. You can also go to our friend Google and say volunteer job descriptions, and you can find a lot of free samples from different organizations of how to put together a job description. So your volunteer job description doesn't have to be long. I encourage you to include the title of the position, if it's a chair, what committee they're the chair of and how that relates to other people on the committee. And then just like one paragraph about what you're asking them to do. Also, somebody asked for me to repeat the name of the book. It's called Lincoln on Leadership. And I have also put that in the chat, but it's a book called Lincoln on Leadership. And it's a very good book. And I highly recommend it. Again, we did use that in a volunteer leadership program I was part of as a staff person. Any other questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cecilia. And thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is being recorded, and I will share a link out with the group along with the slide presentation and next week's issue of Latest News. But if anyone has any questions after this call, feel free to send them to me, and I'd be happy to put you in contact with Cecilia. And
Yes,
thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. And thank you for the kind comments in the chat.
Have a great day, everyone.